Hi everyone, this is Shivam. Welcome to the third video of the series Kubernetes for Beginners. Let me ask you a simple question. When you deploy an application in Kubernetes, where does your container actually run? On a node? Inside Kubernetes? Inside a pod? Most beginners get confused here, and the confusion blocks everything else. So in this video, we will clearly understand pods versus nodes, and finally answer where your containers actually run in Kubernetes. So let's head to the presentation and deep dive into this. So you must be wondering, where does a container run? On a node? On a pod? So before Kubernetes, things were simple. You had one server and you run a container on that server. So one container, one machine. But Kubernetes works differently. In Kubernetes, containers do not run directly on nodes. Containers always run inside pods, and pod runs on nodes. That relationship is the key. So let's break it down slowly. So you might be wondering, what is a node? A node is simply a machine. It can be either a virtual machine or a physical server. This is the place where CPU exists, RAM exists, and disk exists. Worker nodes are where your application runs. But here is an important part. Kubernetes does not put containers directly on node. The node is just the host. Something else sits in between. And that something is called a pod. So, what is a pod? A pod is the smallest deployable unit in Kubernetes. Don't think of a pod as a container. Think of a pod as a wrapper around containers. A pod can contain one container, which is mostly common, or multiple containers that must run together. Like we can see here, our pod is having three containers inside it. One is the app container, second is the logging container, and third is the monitoring container. Inside a pod, container shares the same IP address, containers share the same network, and containers can talk using localhost. So, Kubernetes never manages containers directly. Kubernetes manages pods. That's a very important idea. Now let's see how pods and containers differ from each other. Let me make this very clear. Docker manages containers. Kubernetes manages pods. Containers live inside pods. Pods live on nodes. So the actual hierarchy looks like this. If you have to remember one thing from this video, remember this structure. You might be wondering why pods exist. Now the obvious question is, why not just run containers directly on nodes? Why introduce pods? This is because Kubernetes needs a way to group containers that must work together. For example, your application container, a logging container, a monitoring container. All these three containers must start together, stop together, live together, and share a network. Pods make that possible. That's why pod exists. Now here is an important rule everyone must know. Pods are temporary. If pod crashes, Kubernetes does not restart the same pod. Instead, Kubernetes creates a new pod. So, new pod, new IP, and the old pod disappears. That's why you should never rely on pod's IP address directly. This is also why services exists, which we will cover in next video. Let's summarize everything. Nodes are machines. Pods are Kubernetes units. Container runs inside pods. Pods run on nodes. Kubernetes manages pods and not containers. So, when someone asks, where does my container run in Kubernetes? The correct answer is inside a pod, running on a node. Once this clicks, Kubernetes becomes much easier. Now let's head to the demo section and see how pods are created in Kubernetes. So we can see here, these are my nodes. I have one control plane node and two worker nodes. These are just the machines and nothing is running yet. Let's create a pod in a very simple way using imperative commands. I'm using kubectl run command to create the pod. The name of the pod is demo pod and I'm using nginx as its image. Now, I'm trying to create a pod here. I'm not directly creating a container. Kubernetes will automatically create a pod and place the container inside it. Let's check the pod. It says the pod is up and running. Notice something important? Kubernetes shows me a pod and not a container. Because Kubernetes does not manage containers directly. Instead, it manages pods. Let's do a describe on the pod. Here you see the container is running inside the pod. This is the container ID and this is the image what we use to create this container. So the container is real, but Kubernetes groups it inside a pod. This pod is what Kubernetes schedules on a node. So where this pod is running? This pod is running on my local Kubernetes cluster, and let's see on which node it is running. By the way, this -o white flag can be used to get additional information about the resources. So as we can see here, our pod is running on kind cluster 1 worker node. And what all different nodes do we have? We have 3 nodes. One is the control plane node and another one is worker node 1 and then worker node 2. So our pod is running on worker node 1. So the hierarchy becomes very clear now. Container runs inside a pod and pod runs on a node. Now we also see an IP address is assigned to this pod. In case if this pod crashes or if we delete a pod and then recreate this pod, then this pod will be assigned a new IP address. Let's try doing that. So there are no pods currently running in the default namespace. Let's try recreating the pod. We can clearly see that the new pod is assigned a new IP address compared to this old pod. This old pod is having 10.244.2.4 as its IP address. However, the new pod with the same name is having an IP address which is 10.244.1.2. And this is exactly why services exist in Kubernetes, which we will discuss in the next video. So again, if you have to remember one thing from this video, remember this structure that container lives inside pod, pod runs on node. In the next video, we will answer big questions. If pods keep changing IP addresses, how do users reach your application? And that is where Kubernetes Services comes into picture. Try running a pod in your system by installing Minikube and let me know in the comment section how it went. That's it for today. I'll see you in the next one. Till then, keep learning.